Mason-Dixon line set the state boundaries between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, and parts of Virginia and colonial North America, and between their successor state members of the United States. Virginia's first permanent settlement, Jamestown, was established by the Virginian Company of London in 1607. The fort was erected on a peninsula on the James River. Maryland was established by the Calverts in 1632 when they received a grant that gave him all the land north of the Potomac to the 40th parallel and from the Atlantic Ocean west to the source of the Potomac River. Delaware was settled by the Dutch and Swedes. Dutch colonists settled at the bottom of the Delaware Bay and created a trading post at Fort Nassau in 1631. Pennsylvania was settled by Sir William Penn. His son William Penn petitioned King Charles for a grant of land north of the Maryland colony as repayment of a debt that was owed him. In 1681, Charles granted Penn all the land extending 5 degrees west from the Delaware River between the 40th parallel and 43rd parallels, excluding the lands held by the Duke of York within a 12-mile circle centered on Newcastle, plus the lands to the south that had been ceded by the Dutch. The Calvert family had plenty of time to get the 40th parallel surveyed and marked, but they never bothered to do so. As a result, Philadelphia was established at the upper limit on the Delaware and below the 40th parallel. Pennsylvania colonists settled areas west and south of the city with no resistance from the Calverts. William Penn wanted to give his colony better access to the Atlantic, so he leased the Duke of York's land from Newcastle down to Cape Henlopen. In 1682, Penn officially took control of the 3 lower counties on the Delaware Bay. Penn negotiated with Lord Baltimore in 1682 to establish a formal boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, which would include the 3 lower counties. The Calverts wanted a survey to determine the rightful owners of the 40th parallel. The conflict began between the two sides at this point because they could not come to an agreement on how the survey was to be conducted or where the lines was to be drawn. A compromise made by Charles II might have been possible at this point if Penn hadn't received a land grant for the lower 3 counties along the Delaware Bay. Penn took his case to the Commission for Trade and Plantations. The commission determined that the land lying north of Cape Henlopen between the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay should be divided equally. The western half would belong to the Calverts and the eastern half would belong to the Crown, giving that portion of land to William Penn. The north-south boundary between Maryland and the 3 lower counties was now legally defined, but the east-west boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland remained unresolved. In 1685, William of Orange seized the English throne. The Calverts lost ownership over Maryland, and William's Penn ownership over Pennsylvania was suspended until 1694. The Calverts did not get Maryland back until 1713. William Penn came back to America around 1699 and granted Pennsylvania and the 3 lower counties their own elected legislatures under the Charter of Privileges. He also commissioned Thomas Pearson and Isaac Taylor to survey the 12-mile radius arc boundary between Newcastle and Chester counties. They complete the survey in 10 days just using a chain and compass. The survey marks were tree blazes, and once they disappeared, the location of the arc boundary was mostly a matter of what the local people could remember. In 1731, the 5th Lord Baltimore petitioned King George II for an official resolution of the boundaries dispute. The Calverts were still trying to hold on to the 40th parallel, but Pennsylvania colonists had settled the land for long enough that allowing the Calverts to hold on to the 40th parallel was no longer reasonable. In 1732, parties agreed that the boundary line should run east from Cape Henlopen to the middle point of the peninsula, north to form an angle with the west side of the 12-mile radius arc around Newcastle, then around the arc to its northernmost point, then due north to an east-west line 15 miles south of Philadelphia. The Calverts did not like this idea at all. The map placed Cape Henlopen 20 miles south of where it was supposed to be. This caused great conflict because it was marked that way on purpose. They were trying to deceive the Calverts and take land that wasn't theirs. This border conflict led to violence. In 1736, Pennsylvanian colonists attacked a Maryland farmstead. The Calverts had hired a survey party to do another survey, and they were run off by a mob in 1743. In 1750, the Court of Chancery established a bipartisan commission to do another survey and mark the boundaries that had been set in the 1732 agreement. Local surveyors were hired to mark the east-west transpeninsular line from Fenwick Island to the Chesapeake Bay in 1750 and 1751. Once they determined this line, they then marked the southwest corner of the three lower counties. There was continuing conflict throughout the whole time they were conducting this survey because no one could decide how the line should be determined. Should they be determined by horizontal measures or by the slopes of the terrain? No one agreed. The British Crown was so tired of the fighting going on over the boundary lines between Pennsylvania and Maryland that they demanded the dispute be settled according to the agreement that had been made in 1732. Due to an error in surveying, the Royal Charter granted Maryland the territory north of the Potomac River, up the 14th parallel, which would put Philadelphia, the major city of Pennsylvania, within Maryland. These two charters overlapped, and neither side was willing to give up the overlapped land. A compromise was finally reached in 1767 when the boundary was fixed. The Maryland-Pennsylvania boundary was marked 15 miles south of the southernmost point in Philadelphia. The Delaware-Maryland boundary line was set so that the existing transpeninsular line is from the Atlantic Ocean to the Chesapeake Bay. The boundary was originally marked by stones at each mile marker. These crown stones were placed at each 5-mile marker. They had a family coat of arms engraved in them and faced the state they represented. The Mason-Dixon line is made up of 4 segments: the tangent line, the north line, the arc line, and the 39-degree 43-end parallel. In April 1765, Mason and Dixon began to survey the Maryland Peninsula line. It took them 4 years to complete this process. They were commissioned to run it for a distance of 5 degrees of longitude west from the Delaware River, fixing the western boundary of Pennsylvania. But because the conflicts with the Iroquois Indians not wanting to go past their borders, they had to stop there and make their final observations there. They used new tools that had never been used before create and record the boundaries. These include a transit and equal altitude instrument, a telescope with crosshairs mounted with precision adjustment screws to sight exact horizontal points and to determine true north. They also brought a Hadley quadrant used to measure angular distances. They also had a precision brass measure to calibrate the chain lengths and wood measuring rods to measure level distances across sloping grounds. With these new tools, Mason and Dixon would be able to create more accurate boundaries for the 4 colonies and hopefully bring an end to the conflict between them. The Mason-Dixon line was resurveyed 3 times, 1894, 1900, and the 1960s. The Mason-Dixon line was not only a boundary between states, it was also a boundary between free and slave states. Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1781, while Delaware did not. Delaware remained a slave state up until the Civil War. The Mason-Dixon line was also used in debates that led to the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise extended the Mason-Dixon line westward to the Ohio River. The line was also a way to end a border dispute and become best known as the line separating slave and free states. The Mason-Dixon line settled the argument between the Calverts and the Penns, Maryland and Pennsylvania. It was marked by milestone and crown stones. It took 4 years to survey. It divided the North from the South. It extended 233 miles through Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia.